Welcome to A Sense of Hope podcast by One Life. I am your host, Helen Diveston, a registered nurse and life coach. Through insightful conversations and uplifting stories, we will aim to break boundaries and instill a sense of hope in every listener. As a reminder, this information is not to be taken as medical advice. Please consult your healthcare practitioner before making any changes to your healthcare regime. Let's get started. Welcome to A Sense of Hope podcast by One Life. I'm your host, Helen Diveston, and today we are speaking to Zoe McLaren. For 24 years, Zoe was a doctor. She was a paediatrician who worked at Starship Hospital. However, Zoe chose to retire from medicine in 2018. In 2011, at the very young age of 42, Zoe had a stroke. She received immediate medical care and had a remarkable recovery. But the event inspired Zoe to improve her health and well-being. Her journey taught her that prioritising self-care is the cornerstone of good health and prevention of disease. Zoe understands that every aspect of health is important: nutrition, exercise, sleep, having purpose, and that they all influence each other. You are speaking my language there, Zoe. Zoe has now retrained as a certified nutritional and health coach, and her focus now as a health professional is to empower other people to take charge of their health. She has created her own business based on this, called Healthy, Happy Body. She supports people to take charge of their health and live the life that they deserve for now and in their future. Zoe is HACANSA accredited, and we'll get Zoe to explain what that is, and is a certified positive medicine practitioner. Wow, welcome Zoe.
Hi.
Lovely to have you on the Sense of Hope podcast.
Thank you.
So I think your story is quite remarkable, and I think when I sort of suggested to you that your story was remarkable, you're like, oh no, it's just my experience. So I'm looking forward to hearing about your transformation, but I really wanted to start with why medicine, because I think as health professionals, we often go into this profession driven, or sometimes for me, for example, it was, are you going to be a nurse or are you going to be a school teacher? Because that's all the options that were given to us all those years ago. But what was your why? What made you go into medicine in the first place?
Oh, that's an interesting question, actually. And it's such a long time ago now, in a time of my life where I was just so young. I was in my last year at college. I was only 17 when my English teacher asked me what I wanted to do with my life. And I actually thought I'd go into journalism. And he just kind of just threw out there, oh, I think you'd be a great doctor. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And no one in my family had ever been to university. There was no one medical in my family. So it was really left field. But I started thinking about it, and I switched from doing sort of like art subjects to science subjects. And I was a really good student at school. I've never considered myself highly intelligent, but I'm a hard worker, and I'm really comprehensive in the way that I approach learning. And so I started learning sciences and stuff, and I thought, oh yeah, and I realized I was actually really fascinated by the body and how it works, and so I just kind of just applied, and by the skin of my teeth managed to get into Auckland Medical School. And so I just found myself there, and I was only 18, and it was tough. It was really tough.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's the question I wanted to ask you. What was it like? What was it like being a doctor, and what's it like working in the medical system?
I didn't know what I was in for, and um, I did okay with the study part of medical school. I certainly wasn't anywhere near the top or anything like that, but I managed to get myself through. But even in those last 3 years of med school where you're attached to wards and you're learning, um, I found myself always at the back of the crowd, always trying to hide. Um, and I realize now, reflecting back on that time in my life, that I was actually still really firmly stuck in my adolescence. And I didn't have a great self-concept. And so I was afraid. I felt really threatened by the questions from consultants and things like that. And I was always worried I was going to get things wrong. And so I kind of took that with me into my medical career. I guess imposter syndrome essentially is what I was suffering from the entire 24 years of being a doctor. And I
It's
don't think that's unique. I think a lot of my colleagues have felt very similarly. And we're generally people who want to help, we want to solve, we want to fix. Um, and I think we are really hard on ourselves when we can't do that to our satisfaction and to the satisfaction of our patients. So it was
I was
tough.
just, yeah, I was just going to say, the medical profession is not a very nurturing profession,
No.
despite the fact that we are there to nurture and help others. Within the actual profession itself, it's quite hard going, and I've certainly heard from other doctors and the horrendous stories
Oh,
of
yeah.
bullying, and
Mm. And it doesn't
it's a tough
stop.
environment.
Yeah, and it doesn't stop. I mean, I managed to I took a bit of a break. I met someone when I was 24 and we fell in love and I did my first year or two as a house surgeon. So my very first year was actually at Hawke's Bay Hospital, where, I would be the only doctor in the hospital at night. It was crazy in my first year of medicine. And you know, you don't know what you don't know. And I reflect back on that and think, oh my God, I am so lucky that I didn't end up before the Health and Disability Commission. But anyway, I fell in love and I didn't really know which direction I wanted to go in medicine. And I was still by no means mature or grown up. And when I was 27, we decided to go overseas. And that was amazing because actually, in that year and a half we were overseas, and I was forced to get work as a locum in overseas hospitals for short bursts of time in order to fund our travels. That's when I really started to realize a bit more about who I was, what I was capable of. And I came back and I went into the paediatric training program. And so I managed to get myself through that. I got through my professional exams this time, um, and I always reflect back on that thinking probably one of the biggest strengths I had as a doctor was my ability to be empathetic with people, to show compassion and to listen. That was my biggest strength, not so much as a diagnostician. Can't get that word out.
I'm not
Sometimes I
going to be
still
able to
have
say it
problems
now
with
either.
my words. Yeah. Every now and then I still have problems with my
Diagnostician,
words.
no, I won't
Yeah.
even bother trying.
Diagnostician.
Yeah.
And, and that was always, again, that little voice in the back of my head, oh, you're just not quite good enough, you know.
Oh
But
gosh.
I knew I was good enough when it came to actually being with people, being in the moment and listening. And pediatrics is a really good fit for me because I could get down on the floor and play with kids. I could connect with them. But I somehow ended up gravitating towards child protection. And I, in a time, and there was a part of my time of my life as a doctor when I was actually doing both general pediatrics and child protection, and I was having babies. And it was, I don't actually know how we survived as a family, how we got through that. It was really, really tough being a sleep deprived mum and seeing things each day in child protection that were actually traumatizing and still trying to keep on top of the general pediatric literature for my general pediatric work. And anyway, yeah, it was hard. It was hard. And I guess I was just surviving rather than thriving.
Which is probably how a lot of, I would say, especially early doctors would feel in their career, especially if they're going into consultancy. and you're a mother, and you're, trying to raise children and do everything else. And it's often not until we look back and we
Mm.
go, what the heck was I doing? Like,
Mm.
how did I manage this?
Mm.
So I guess, talking about stress and the impact on you, do you think, I mean, you had this stroke at the age of 42.
Mm.
What are your thoughts about that in relation to the life that you were living?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a long story in that after I had my second child, I was 36, turned 36 4 days after I had her. And I'd always done a lot of walking, but I realized how stressed I was. And so I decided to start running. And I loved it. Would throw my shoes on, I'd run out the door, and I would run as hard and as fast as I could. I used to be a really athletic child, and but I didn't have any other concepts about stress management. That was my effort to try and manage my stress and do something for myself. And what I ended up doing was I must have had very, very poor running style. And I ran myself into the ground, and I actually gave myself a stress fracture through the neck of my femur that was unstable. And I had to have a rod put into my femur. And that was when I was 38. I kept running, and I kept ignoring the fact that I had lower back pain. But I had realized at the time that I was having my rod put in that I had actually already started to develop a scoliosis. And I kind of thought maybe I'd always had that. It was just getting a bit worse. And I mentioned it to the orthopedic surgeon, but classical kind of orthopedic surgeon, oh no, we're just here to deal with your hip. And so they didn't want to even go there. And by the time I was 42, I'd seen physios, I'd seen exercise therapists, I was doing all the recommended exercises for my core, but my back was absolutely stuffed. I had ruined 3 discs in my lower spine, and one of them had worn so thin that the vertebrae had actually slipped off laterally. Not completely. I didn't have any spinal cord compression, but I had, I had slipped it off, and that's actually what had was the cause of the scoliosis. My spine was just basically doing this, and I had this big hump on my back, and I couldn't stand for longer than 10 minutes. It was really painful. And in the end, the specialist back therapist, physiotherapist that I saw said, look, you've got to go see a surgeon. And so I had lots of scans, and eventually he said, we need to straighten you up. This is not going to get any better. And you've actually got quite advanced osteoarthritis throughout your whole spine. So, and he said, you can never run again because you've done this to yourself through running, probably. Yeah. So I went ahead and I had the surgery, and it was all going fine. But 3 days before my stroke, I had to go back to work. So I'd been off work for 6 weeks. Um, I have to confess that throughout my entire life as a doctor, and including in my late teens and going into medical school, one of my major coping mechanisms was alcohol. And, and I do know that I actually had an alcohol abuse problem for all of those years. And I had tried to address it at times, but it just put me in a completely different space when I was drinking. And it was usually in the context of just being with other people and having lots of fun, loud music, dancing, and it was great. But I knew it wasn't good for me. And I hadn't had anything to drink in that whole 6 weeks post surgery because I was on tramadol and other heavy sort of, um, pain relief medication, because I actually had a 3-level spinal fusion. So it was a big operation. It was a 9-hour surgery. And I'd gone back to work. I was stressed absolutely to the max. And my consultant, my clinical director, had said to me, well, you need to go back on the roster. And I'd only started driving like a day before I went back to work. And so he was expecting me to do the call overnight and see physical and sexual abuse again and all that sort of stuff. And that was the job description. But I kind of thought there would be a little bit of a easing back into it after that, and there wasn't. And I got really stressed, and I went out with friends, and I had probably three-quarters of a bottle of wine. And when I went to bed that night, my heart was jumping around all over the place. It was just, and I was lying in bed, and I knew I was having missed beats. And I thought, oh, yeah, well, this has happened to me before. I know that I've just had too much to drink, and I'll probably be all right in the morning. And I got up in the morning, and I was standing talking to my children, who were only 5 and 8. And then all of a sudden, I didn't know where my hand was in space. And I was trying to grab it from behind my back. I couldn't, I just didn't know where it was. And I could see their faces, and they were looking at me in horror. And I tried to talk to them, say, I'm okay, it's all right. But I just grunted, and I was drooling. My entire face was weak. And I sort of managed to stumble across to a chair and sit down. That I was kind of coming in and out of consciousness. And the next thing I remember is an ambulance coming. And they lay me down on the floor. And some of my consciousness came back as my blood pressure sort of stabilized a little bit, lying down flat. But yeah, it
Wow.
was really, really, really scary. And it was incredibly scary for my children because they thought I was dying. And my 8-year-old son, he raced upstairs and got my husband, who was still upstairs in bed. And
Thank goodness.
yeah, yeah. So there was another adult at home, and you know, they the staff were amazing. The St. John's, kudos to St. John's, they were incredible. They got there fast. They recognised immediately that I was having a stroke. They put me in the ambulance, and that's when I really came to. And I remember looking up and seeing this really kind paramedic's face looking at me saying, "You're having a stroke, but it's going to be okay."
Wow.
And
Wow.
he was so kind. And I got to the hospital, and everyone was so kind. And it was a Sunday and a long weekend. And they just raced around, and the neurologist on call actually came in and talked to me in person. And I got medicine to burst the clot that had gone to my brain. And the working diagnosis was that I must have had an occult clot in my legs post surgery. And I firmly believe that the alcohol I had contributed because my heart rate was all over the show. And I probably had a clot sort of like bouncing around in my heart. And I had a hole in my heart I didn't know that I had. And the clot went through the hole and up into my head. And
Wow.
so I subsequently had that hole closed.
God, Lord. I just want to go back. When did you or did you realize that you were having a stroke? Was it when the ambulance officer told you, or
Yeah.
did you have a suspicion before then? Did you really
I
have
don't,
no idea?
no, I knew when I saw my kids' faces, I knew something really serious was wrong. But I was so like, I was really out of it, and I knew that I just needed to go and sit down, or I was going to fall down. But it wasn't until I was in the ambulance, and he said to me, the paramedic said to me, "You're having a stroke," that I thought, yeah, yeah, you're right, I'm having a stroke.
Wow. Okay. All right.
Yeah. Mm.
But your recovery sounds like it was quite remarkable.
Yeah, it has been really remarkable. The neurologist, when I went to see him 6 weeks post for follow up, he said, "You have had a really remarkable recovery. I saw you in that emergency room when it was happening, and I cannot believe that you're the way you are now." I was
Wow.
incredibly lucky. So I still had a very small part of my brain die, a very small part, but because the clot was burst, essentially, blood flow was able to go back through that particular artery and perfuse my brain again. I got the oxygen and the nutrients that I needed for my brain to recover. So, but it took a while. Like I had a lot of speech hesitancy and word finding issues for probably a year, and a lot of cognitive fatigue. Like I was so tired, and it was almost like that very first trimester of being pregnant, where you're just absolutely exhausted. And I felt like that for a long time. And I didn't
Mm,
have the capacity to spend a lot of time with people. I needed to just keep going to sleep, and I couldn't read for quite a while. Like I could, but I had to read like books with really large print because I couldn't track the words in small print in just a normal textbook. Um, so yeah, there was it was definitely a journey getting back to
mm,
feeling more like myself.
mm.
Yeah, it was
And so,
yeah
so
incredible, really.
somehow, yeah, it is incredible. It sounds incredible. But at some stage after all that, you've obviously had a bit of a, I don't know whether it's an epiphany or a realization, or that
Yeah.
perhaps the way that you were living your life was actually having a toll on you.
Yeah, well, I classic me. I remember my clinical director coming to see me in hospital, and he said you have to take 3 months off, and I said no, I'll be absolutely fine in my hesitant speech, and he goes, no, you've had a stroke, you need to take 3 months off. And I was a people pleaser. I was trying my best to do everything for everybody, and I knew he was right internally. I knew he was right, and so I let myself take that 3 months off. And when I came back to work, the hospital said I needed to see an occupational health physician, and I sat with her. We worked out a program of getting back to work, and it was only like 2 hours a day to start with. But I realized really quickly that I wasn't going to progress past 2 hours a day for quite a long time. And the pressure was already coming on to go back on the roster, not immediately, but the clinical director said, I'm prepared to give you a year to fully rehab, but then you need to go back on the roster for physical and sexual abuse and do the same as everybody else. And I came home and I was really upset. I was in tears, and I realized that I was already burnt out before my
Mm,
stroke happened, and I
mm,
had made moves to try and make things more achievable for me. I dropped the general pediatric work. I had sort of segued into a children in care clinic where I managed to get out of the physical space of the child protection unit for a day a week, seeing kids in care in a sort of like a pilot program type thing. But I just knew it. It just it wasn't a good fit for me anymore, but it also wasn't a good fit for my family. Like I was missing so much of my kids growing up. They'd been in daycare since they were babies, and they had been sick all the time. And
mm,
one of them had already had grommets and her tonsils out because she had obstructive sleep apnea because she was always sick with respiratory tract infections. And I was guilty for that. And so anyway, I realized that one, I was already burnt out, and two, that my stroke gave me permission to put my hand up and say, you know what, this is just too hard. I don't want to do it anymore. And so I
So,
resigned. I left.
uh, so you left.
I
Wow.
left. And they just let me go. I asked if I could just go and work in the clinic, seeing kids in care full time. And they said, no, that's not gonna work. It's not gonna fit within how the unit's working. So I said, okay, well, I'm just going to resign. So I did.
Ooh, that's not an unfamiliar story, to be
Mm,
honest.
yeah,
That is not an
yes.
unfamiliar story. I'm, oh, there's so much in all of that. I'm really curious because you've mentioned a few things about people pleasing, and I don't think you mentioned the word guilt, but just that, your children really,
Yeah.
you felt like your children perhaps didn't have a mother to bring them up. They were always in
Mm.
daycare and all that sort of thing. And I wonder how much of, I mean, Gaba Mate and all these people that are talking about how personalities and how they can affect our physical health as well.
Yeah. Mm.
Have you done a lot of diving into sort of that area, and or what have you learned about yourself if you've sort of looked at that side of things?
Yeah, I have. I really have actually. So I'm always reading. I'm always finding the next book. And each one of these books that you read, they always recommend other books. It's great because you just go from one to the other. And every time you come away with something new.
Yeah.
And it's just a fantastic journey. And yeah, I stayed in medicine for 7 years. I was working on contract to rangatamariki, seeing kids in care who'd been exposed to alcohol prenatally. And I did it very part-time. I wasn't making much money. And that wasn't a prime necessity, but I got to a point where I realized that I was spending so much time having to meet my requirements for continuing professional development for very little to show for it in terms of actually being a doctor, that started to impact on me. And I also started to acknowledge to myself that I was just so sad. I'd heard so many sad stories in the 17
Mm.
years that I did child protection. And I had also started to appreciate, actually years before when I was still in the child protection team, that intergenerational cycle of abuse and neglect was just such an awful trap for people to find themselves in. I had so much empathy for parents that hurt their children. And I know that's really weird to say that, but these are people that are always in defensive mode. They never have
Yeah.
the opportunity to grow because they're hurt as children, they don't attach as children, they don't develop and grow up. And so many of them were actually also alcohol exposed. It was this really big intergenerational cycle. And so if you've got a brain that's exposed to alcohol in utero, you can't develop good executive functioning. So how can people expect you to plan and organize your life and budget your money and all those things? And I could see this was happening to these people, that this had happened to these people. And eventually it sort of got to a point where I had to acknowledge that actually some of that had happened to me. I have my own trauma history, and it's probably why I ended up gravitating into child protection in the first place, because I had a sense of empathy with children that were hurt. And my story was nowhere near as bad as any of these stories. And I had thought, okay, I'm actually doing some healing, working with these people and with these children, because mine wasn't nearly as bad, but I hadn't actually appreciated the impact that it actually had on my ability to grow up and mature and take responsibility for myself. And so my journey has actually been towards putting things in my life and taking charge of my life and my health post stroke in order to be the best person that I can be for me, but also for everybody that's in my life. And hopefully for the clients that I work with as a health coach. But part of that journey has also meant an incredible amount of learning. And it's really exciting to actually have the opportunity to have learned so much more about the way medicine could be.
Yes.
Like,
Oh my God, that's a huge topic. Yeah.
because,
Yeah.
when you actually are stuck as a doctor working in a hospital system, you're delivering sick care, you're not delivering health care. And healthcare to me is about helping people understand the impact of their genes, their environment, and their lifestyle choices. And this isn't to blame them for their lifestyle choices, but it's to help them understand, okay, we are where we are. We all have stories. Can we just move on and actually make some positive choices for positive outcomes as we grow up into people, you know?
100%.
So,
100%.
yeah,
And that's as you know, probably why I'm so passionate about what I do, because when you know what you know and you understand how
Yeah.
much you can change your health outcomes,
Yeah.
it's like, why wouldn't you? You know, a lot of the time we think it's genetics or, oh, it's just the way it is. And you're like, no, 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 no. You know, there is so much we can do. And having knowledge is a way of empowering people to change their
Yeah.
lives. And as a health professional, it's exhausting if all you're doing is putting on band-aids
Mm.
and just going, okay, so here's another band-aid, here's another band-aid, I'll probably see you again, you know, in another few weeks, but here's another band-aid, or here's band-aids often being medication. And it's not a rewarding profession to be in if that's what you're doing. And I do wonder, you know, this talk about not enough doctors and doctors being burnt out. I personally don't think it's because there's not enough doctors. And I think the reason why doctors are burning out is because it's not a satisfying, rewarding job a lot
Mm.
of the time. Many times it is. But it's not, you're not getting the satisfaction of watching people change and grow and get
Mhm.
well and have an inspired life or whatever it might
Oh,
be. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And, you know, when I was doing a lot of general pediatric call at Starship Hospital, and when I was training, which I predominantly was at Starship, I cycled through the respiratory wards, the oncology wards, the gastroenterology wards, and all of that stuff. And the same kids kept coming back. And they were getting sicker and sicker and sicker and sicker. And we had a little word that we'd write in the notes was social issues.
Mm.
And we'd get a social worker to come and see them. But that's a band-aid too. And, you know, we'd never had the time to satisfy our own internal need to get to the root cause of their illness. I had that internal need. I always was asking myself, why? And I knew a lot of it was because of the home environments that so many of these kids were stuck in because of inequities, because of people living in poverty, living in damp, crowded houses. You know, the number of kids that came back with such terrible chest disease,
Mm.
it's just so sad. And I think you're right. I think we get frustrated as doctors that we're not actually helping people heal. We're just like putting on band-aids. We're not, you know, we we're designed to heal as
Yeah.
doctors,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
but we
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
actually get the opportunity to do that. And like in my own family history, I've got terrible genes. I've got a parent that's got type 2 diabetes, heart disease, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, terrible back disease. I've inherited the back disease. I've inherited the high cholesterol. I've chosen to empower myself to live a lifestyle, to do my best to have the longest health span that I can
Mm.
and keep my disease span as short as I can.
Mm.
Because I
Mm.
want to live a life that where I can go out and do things, where I can play on the floor with my grandchildren when my kids finally get there. Um, you know, I want to go out with my friends and I want to be out in nature walking and walking my dog
Yeah.
and it's really
Yeah.
sad when I see my parent like have it as resorted to a wheelchair to get
Mm.
around
Mm.
most of the
Mm.
time. And that's it's really sad to see somebody who hasn't been able to have the opportunity to get the sort of care that I hope I can give to people, not care, the help, the kind of healing I can give to
Mm.
people as a health coach.
Mm. So this is so there's a couple of things about this. So I mean, from a doctor to a health coach, it just seems like a lot of people will be thinking, "Oh, you're up here, and now you're like down here. What on earth is she doing?" So I can imagine that there might be some judgment. I don't know. That's, you know, that's the top of my mind. So what has that transition been like for you?
It's been amazing. I mean, I'm in an incredibly fortunate position that I worked really hard as a doctor for a good, oh, yeah, 17 years in the health system where I was earning good money. And I've never been a splurger. So I saved and paid off the mortgage. And I didn't earn a lot in that last 7 years as a doctor, but that was okay. And that was actually a good transition because I came to understand actually money isn't important in my life. And that's a very privileged thing to say because I don't have a mortgage anymore. But I'm in the fortunate position where I can do what I want with the health expertise that I have,
Mm.
and I don't have to earn a big wage. And so I don't do it for the money. I do it because I want meaning and purpose in my life.
Mm.
And being a nutrition health coach, especially evolving into a positive medicine practitioner, which is the direction that I'm heading in, is what's going to give me that meaning and purpose. And I can do this until I'm in my late 70s.
Yeah, yeah. And
I
people
can
who
do it
come and see you,
online. I
absolutely.
don't
People who,
have to go and work in a hospital. I can run my life. I can get up and do my exercise in the morning. I can walk the dog. I can, it's great.
yeah. And people who come and see you get a double whammy because they get they get the doctor side if that's needed, but they also get this amazing holistic approach to health. And so,
I just have to say one point on that though, because I'm formally retired, I don't provide medical care. So
right.
I took myself off the medical register on purpose in 2018, and it was this big weight off my shoulders.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I can imagine
Yeah.
that actually.
But
Yeah. But you've still got the knowledge.
I do have the knowledge and I have a huge
Yeah.
understanding of how health impacts the body, of how disease impacts the body. And I'm really happy to talk that through with
Mm.
clients if they want to. It's their
Yeah.
journey. So I'm led by them in the work that I
Yeah.
do.
You mentioned positive medicine, and so I'd love to touch on that as well. And you and I have both been involved in the Positive Medicine Academy, I think is the word
Yeah,
that David has called it. And so I guess, we've got this medical model that, in my mind, at least for chronic illness and chronic disease, isn't working very well, and especially for my speciality, mental health, I think
yeah.
it is not working very well. What do you think we need to be doing to have a shift in our healthcare industry? What do you think it is that needs to change? And I know that perhaps the positive medicine model may be part of this.
Yeah. Look, I think we're always going to need doctors at the coalface in the hospital system because the reality is that people are still going to get sick and and people are still going to need surgery and people are still going to fall over and hurt themselves. And so that definitely needs to stay. But I think in the primary healthcare system, there needs to be an added layer. And I see that that's where health coaches like me and you fit in, where we can work alongside primary care to help people implement changes in their lifestyle in order to give them the longest health span and try and keep their disease span as short as possible for when they need that next level of care in the hospital system. And when I talk about health span, this is about the number of years in your life where you have health, where you can do all the things that you want to do and you're not dealing with illness. Disease span has unfortunately got longer and longer and longer for a lot of people. And
Mm.
I feel that the basis of that is actually about this concept in positive medicine called whole person health that we've lost in the primary care
Mm.
sector because doctors are so busy. It's not that they don't have the will to do this, it's just that they're running in business models and they're just having to just have 10 to 15-minute slots with people. How can they possibly help people to see the connection between their physical, psychological, emotional, and spiritual health, which is whole person health? And all of those things interact and flow together.
Mm.
And underlying all of that is a level of stress. We get stressed in every single one of those health pillars, and that leads to chronic inflammation and that leads to disease. And so the healthcare model is unfortunately, in my mind, more a sick care model. And I feel that there's another layer of health professional that could step in there, and that's health coaches, to just empower people to get the information they need to make the changes that they want for the life that they want to lead. And this is about helping people get some vision for their future and how they see themselves in 5, 10, 15 years' time and what direction they want to go in. Does that make sense?
100%. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
100%. I think that's it is a completely new model, and and I think some people might be listening to this thinking, oh well, that's very sort of optimistic, but what's the reality, and can this be done? And so I know that there are more health coaches coming into doctors' practices, and I
Yeah.
think that's amazing. Do you think there's enough acceptance, or do you think that something else needs to change in medicine? Because I've also heard other people say the medical model just needs to kind of, at least for chronic disease, die a slow death, and a new model needs to emerge. Do you think it's possible that, the health coaches and the doctors will have an alliance in the future that works really well, or do you think the whole model is going to have to change?
I'd like to hope that health coaches and doctors can have an alliance and work together. And I think if you can heal the primary health sector so that it's focused on holistic health and whole person health, you can take the load off the hospital system. And that's definitely going to be a transition. It's not going to happen overnight. But if you can take the load off the hospital system, you can then spend less in the hospital system and spend and invest more in people's health care,
Yeah.
whole person health care. And so, but I think the will has to come from the top, probably, because there's no funding right now for a health coach like me. People have to pay to come and see me. And I don't command nearly as much as I could as a doctor. I mean, I've got friends that are charging $400 an hour as a doctor. I charge $100 an hour, and even then I feel guilty for doing that. But I've got to run a business, so it's it's a tricky one. And but wouldn't it be amazing if health coaches were recognised by maybe ACC and maybe by Southern Cross and other health insurers, so people could actually have a visit to a health coach being funded in some way, or even better, that there's a stream of health coaches that are funded by the government, by the
Yeah,
Ministry of Health. And I know that
100%.
there are some sitting in general practice, but I also know from exploring that as an option for myself that they're expected to see 8 or 9 patients a day. And again, that's just another way of putting pressure on the system, because how can a health coach actually effectively work with somebody in that short period of time and see people back to back? I'm sure they can do some great stuff, but they're going to get burnt out if they're
Yeah.
expected to continue to see people,
Yeah.
because you have really in-depth conversations with people as a health coach. You're
Yes.
listening
Yes.
to people, you're
Yeah.
reflecting back to them, you're helping them gain and tap into their inner wisdom. That is something that you need to have a break from in between
Yes.
so that
It
you can
is.
be the best that you can be.
Absolutely. And that just sounds like they're trying to once again impose a model onto a profession, and the same thing will happen. And I think that's where we may get stuck if we're just trying to bring the health coaches into that medical model. Is it just we're going to force a round peg into a square hole once again, and we're going to have the same problem?
Mm.
So yeah, woof, there's we've got a long way to go, but and this is, I think that there's two things I just wanted to sort of touch up on. Um, One is looking back now, what do you think about what happened to you with your stroke? What's your opinion on that event and how the impact that it's had on your life?
Yeah, wow. Um, I've been saying ever since I recovered from it, probably a year post-stroke, wow, that was a great silver lining. Because, like I say, it gave me permission to actually acknowledge to myself that actually my life was too tough for me to handle. I was living in chronic stress, and I was drinking too much, and I now realize that if I had stayed in that system, if I'd carried on doing what I was doing, I'd be sick by now.
Mm,
I would
mm,
absolutely be sick as a dog. I'm healthier now at 55 than I was at 35. I know how to
mm,
look after myself. I have energy, I have enthusiasm for life. And so I'm entirely grateful that I had that stroke. And I look at it as it being at a time in my life that I really needed it because my children were young enough for me to be able to turn around what had been lacking for them in those first few years. I mean, my husband's amazing and he was there for them, but it's a tough call to be a single parent for anybody. And
mm,
essentially, many times he was. And I would be watching sport when they were like, not sport, no. I'd be watching them, I don't know, doing a swim class as a baby or as a toddler or whatever. And all of a sudden I'd have to leave because I'd get a call and I'd have to go into the hospital and I would be absent for entire weekends. And I'd be
mm,
so sleep deprived that I just was, I wasn't, I was irritable,
mm. Yeah,
short
yeah, you were.
tempered.
Yep, I can
Yeah,
imagine. Yeah.
short
So,
tempered. And so I actually think that they've had a much better life as well because I stepped away from that
mm,
and I put
mm,
them as my primary focus.
mm. So it really did um, change completely, overhaul your life, and
Yeah.
in some ways you might see it as a bit of a gift that you were like given this
Yep.
opportunity to start again, perhaps. So I'm curious to ask you, people who are listening this who may be going through a major transition in their lives,
Mm.
do you have any advice? This might be a bit on the spot for you, but do you have any advice, or because often you are in that space at the time and it's overwhelming and you might feel a sense of hopelessness or helplessness. Do you have any advice for people that are perhaps struggling, whether it be a mental health issue or a physical health issue?
Yeah, that's a tough one. The thing that springs to mind are the four principles of positive medicine, which I think are so wise. And the first one is we are where we are. And I think it's about just giving yourself a break and letting go of regrets. Um, I had to let go of my regrets of 30 years of drinking. 30 years, it's a long time. And I still drink alcohol now, but I have a much healthier relationship with it. And so we are where we are. Just take a breath and just acknowledge that you're just human and just let some of that stuff go. And then the second principle is no judgment. And that follows on beautifully because when you stop judging yourself and you realize that you are just human and give yourself a bit of self compassion, you're actually a lot better at not judging other people too. And when you're not judging other people, you actually feel happier because you're not comparing.
Mm,
And then the third one is positive choices for positive outcomes. And that comes back to the fact that we always have choices in our life, no matter how helpless and hopeless we feel, we actually do have that inner strength. And we can just say, actually, stuff it. I just want to do this. And that's actually okay. So positive choices lead to positive outcomes and start small. Just one tiny little thing that you might decide to do for yourself one day that's positive for your overall health and well-being. Just do it and just see where that leads you. And then the last principle is the answers are always within.
Mm.
So that comes back to having an internal locus of control as well, and realizing that you can actually take your life by the reins. You can actually take charge. You just have to choose to. And, you know, we can get stuck in a trap of thinking that life is against us and blaming everything else. But if you follow those kind of guiding principles, you take the pressure off yourself, and then you actually give yourself a moment to stop and reflect and realize that actually you know exactly what you need to do.
Yeah, I love that about the positive medicine model, and I love the idea that it's no longer this doctor patient relationship, that it's
No,
about a partnership. And
yeah,
the doctor may be an expertise in disease, but the patient or the person receiving care is the expert in themselves.
they
And
are.
that is such a wonderful model of care.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I love those principles. Those are guiding principles for life. And you can always come back to them because the other thing that's important to understand as well is this definition of health that David Beaumont uses in positive medicine is that, and it is, that health is the ability to adapt and self-manage in the face of life's challenges. And that's actually all it is. I've had a lot of challenges in my life, and I did not meet those challenges for so many years, but I heard the call when I had a stroke. It was enough of an incentive for me to actually stop and go, oh my goodness, this is hard. I
Yeah.
need to do something differently, and I need to do it for me, and I need to do it for everyone else that I love.
Yeah.
And that's what
Beautiful.
started me on my journey.
Wonderful. Whoa, thank you so much, Zoe. That is just amazing. It's an amazing story. And so, where can people find you? How do they, if they want to come and see you, where do they find you?
So I purposely decided not to do a website because I want to continue to maintain work-life balance in my life. And I realized that if I had a website, anybody can find me. So I hang out on Instagram mostly, and I'm at Healthy Happy Body NZ, and I use it as a platform for just putting up empowering information for people. But people can message me directly through there, and also through WhatsApp Business. Just Healthy Happy Body. You can just send me a WhatsApp message,
Oh, great.
and
Fantastic.
I can
Okay.
reply. I can reply to that. And what I offer is a 15-minute complimentary video call where we can actually meet each other face to face and see whether we can create a partnership that's going to work for the client. And in that video call, we'll talk more about how coaching works and whether it's what they're looking for, because it might not be. But it's just about coming to that as a client with a bit of curiosity and thinking, oh, yeah, this sounds like something I might want to do. Yeah.
Great. Any last words?
No, I just want to thank you. I think you're amazing. Like,
Oh,
you've been on your journey as well. And I think it's fantastic that you've stepped out of that conventional model as well and you're trying to do things differently too. And I love that you've started this podcast because, yeah, it's great to get it out there.
thank you. I appreciate that a lot. That's lovely. Thank you. Wonderful. Well, have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you for your time and energy. This has been lovely. And yeah, thank you for joining us on A Sense of Hope.
Oh,